All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Pastor Daniel Smith, and this is Insights from Within. Ascension is full of interesting people who have something worthwhile to say. And so in this series, I'm interviewing members of Ascension. My hope for all of you watching is that you can listen with open ears, coming to understand one another better, of course, our fellow brothers and sisters, and grow in faith as you do so. The topics are going to vary widely in the series, but the goal remains the same, to come to know one another. Today we have Salinda Kuzma. Salinda's been a longtime member of Ascension, and I look forward to our conversation, Salinda. So let's start with prayer, shall we? Holy God, as we come to know one another better and gain insights from one another's wisdom, we also come to know you and ourselves. I give you thanks for Salinda today. Bless our time together. Amen. Well, Salinda, good to have you. Thanks for doing this with me.
Sure. My pleasure.
Let's start sort of early. Tell me about faith growing up for you. Were you always Lutheran? What drew you to the Lutheran Church, to Ascension? Give us sort of that rundown.
Okay. Well, I was born in a very small Pennsylvania Dutch town in Pennsylvania, for sure.
Yeah.
And everybody in my town was either Lutheran or they attended the United Church of Christ. That was about it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So my friends, since, elementary school, through middle school, through high school, and even through marriage, was all centered around the church.
Did everybody marry a Lutheran then too?
I was the first one in my family to marry someone who wasn't Lutheran.
How'd that go?
Happened to be a Roman Catholic.
How did that go? Was that
quite was quite interesting, because I didn't know a Catholic person until I went to college. So I was, you know what? I have to say, Bob's was an only child.
Mm-hmm.
Mother's name was Mary, father's name was Joseph, and so you see what I was up against. But they accepted me, they really did, and my folks accepted Bob, and so we moved right along.
Wow, when Joseph and Mary met, everyone was eagerly awaiting the birth of their child.
Exactly.
So for you, Lutheran was just like, that's who you've always been. That's just part of your DNA growing up, right?
Right.
But that's not, I don't think that's a sufficient answer when people say, why are you Lutheran? What keeps you in the Lutheran church? What would you say? That's a tougher question.
You know, I find it very comforting because of the way I was brought up, for sure. I like the traditional hymns that we sing.
Yeah.
I find myself being able to worship even better through song, because song is prayer.
Yeah.
And I always felt very comfortable with that. And I've always felt very welcomed in the Lutheran church, very much so. Yeah. And I also, I always felt too that we know that you're saved by grace and not by your works. And that really meant a lot to me, because I'm kind of task oriented. And so if I don't
a little
do
bit
a
of freedom
job,
for that, huh? Yeah.
I'm sorry? What?
A little freedom for you in the grace to get out of the task. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's cool.
But I will say one of the reasons that I got to Ascension is because of Winnie Klein.
Yeah, tell that story.
Yeah, we first got here in 1983, and both Winnie and myself are pediatric physical therapists. And so we were working at the Rocky Mountain Rehab Center. And it didn't take long before we shared that we were both Lutherans from the time we were born. And she said, I go to this really good church in town. And she said, I would love to have you come and look at it and see what you think. So we did. And the rest is history.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Man, 83, just a few years, man, 37 years ago. You've been here a while now.
Right.
That's awesome.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Right. Yeah.
So you mentioned in that conversation, your husband, Bob, right? Roman Catholic. I knew Bob, of course, and he was always Catholic, but he was always Catholic here at our church. So it was one of those things you didn't know. He wasn't officially part of us for a while, but he was a great guy. Bob died not too long ago. What year was it that Bob died? Do you remember?
Sure, 2016.
16. Okay, yeah. Tell us about Bob, about your husband. Who was he? What did you love about Bob? What didn't you love about Bob? I mean,
What
he's a
did
great
I
guy.
love?
Yeah, right.
Well, the thing I loved about him, when I first met him, I realized right away that he was a very caring person. I
Mm.
mean, he immediately told me that I wasn't doing something correctly in a lab that we were in, and I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Well, let me show you how to do this." So I knew that he wanted to help in many ways, and he was always a very loving and caring guy. And I guess I married the guy because I knew he'd always be there for me, to take care of
Yeah,
me and the family. That
yeah.
was always very, very much in the forefront.
And you were right about that, I'm presuming too. He
I
always
was
took care of you.
very, yes, I was
Yeah.
very right about that.
You
Yeah.
mentioned in a lab. Did you guys meet in college then, or
Yes, we did. We met in PT school. We were both physical therapists. I mean, we were in training for PT.
training? Yeah.
But I met him. He was an avid baseball player. And so
Hmm.
he signed right out of high school with the Cincinnati Reds organization.
Yeah.
And so he was gone from college, he would only come to school in the off season.
Oh.
So I didn't really meet him till, it was about the time we were ready to go to PT school.
Oh,
And the
okay.
reason that he left baseball was because he got a head injury. He was a catcher, and there was a pitched ball thrown when he didn't have his mask on, and it hit
Oh,
him on the left side of his face and head. And that pretty much ended his baseball career at that point.
I had forgotten that story. I'd heard it before, but I had forgotten that. So
Yeah.
that's sad that happened. Yeah.
Right, right. So I just really got to know him after the baseball thing was over and we were in PT school, and then Vietnam was going on big time. And
Hmm.
so he decided to go into the Air Force as
Hmm.
a second lieutenant and avoid the draft.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
that's how, I assume that's how you ended up in Colorado Springs too. Was he stationed out here?
right, right.
Yeah.
Our last assignment was here pretty much.
How was it? How was it for Bob? Was that really hard for him when he wasn't able to play baseball anymore? I mean, you didn't know him as well in his baseball time, but I imagine that was really tough for him.
That was his top priority almost all the
Yeah.
time. He loved baseball. He loved watching it. He loved playing it. He loved coaching it. It was who he was. I
Yeah.
mean, he had his identity way back in elementary and middle school, and that's who he was. He did a lot of coaching,
Mhm.
and actually worked a lot in the school districts. He started a training program in
That's
District
right.
11
Yeah.
and in District 20.
It's interesting. I visit a lot of people who are former military, and when I visited Bob later in life, in the assisted living or nursing homes he was in, usually if I visit people who are former military, their walls are like covered in military regalia. Bob's was like covered in baseball stuff, right? Like,
Right,
and so I think you're absolutely right. Like the
right,
center of Bob's life
right.
was baseball
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Well, okay, in that I've kind of alluded to it a little bit that Bob suffered late in life with dementia. Was it officially an Alzheimer's diagnosis? I wasn't sure on that.
No, it was not. It's dementia, but it wasn't an Alzheimer's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell me about when you first started noticing symptoms
Yeah.
with Bob, and how you guys kind of worked through the decision to seek help with that.
Yeah. Well, that was pretty tough because early on, we both saw some signs that he was having a lot of trouble concentrating, and he had lots of anxiety, and he was very impulsive. And so we thought, well, maybe this is adult ADHD going on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So he talked to a doctor about trying some meds, and the doctor said, we need a full psych eval. So we did a psych eval, and it turned out that other things showed up too, that
Sure.
problem solving ability, understanding the directions of things. Anyway, long story short, it started to affect his speech. So
Yeah.
the speech language area was the first area that we saw
Mm-hmm.
decline. And so he decided he'd go to speech therapy. You know, Bob was very competitive, and boy, he said, I can beat this. I can
Sure.
beat this.
Yeah.
So he started speech therapy. And actually, the speech therapist is the one who diagnosed him with something called frontal temporal dementia. And it was primary progressive aphasia, is a variant under frontal temporal dementia.
Yeah.
So she's the one who said, I think this is more than just, you know, typical aging.
Sure.
So we got the diagnosis, and then things progressed to the point where at some point he just wasn't safe at home anymore because, as you know, active Bob, he was out of the house as much as he possibly could. After he lost his driver's license, he just paced and wandered off often.
That had to have been a really hard time when you decided that it wasn't safe for him at home anymore. Was Bob able to be part of that decision, or was that sort of something you had to decide on your own?
He was part of the decision in that he didn't push back about it. I was kind of surprised that he followed the advice of the doctors and of me. And of course, it was a family decision. The other thing that prompted it was because we had sheriffs picking Bob up on a not a daily basis, but often. And they finally said, you got to do something. So we had.
I'm sure he was very nice to them.
Oh, of course he was. Of course he was. But at any rate, the reason that he was admitted to the behavioral health hospital, thinking that maybe with some medication, we could control some of the symptoms, and then I could bring him back home. But that didn't actually ever work.
That had to have been hard. You always kind of held out that hope, or not always, but for a long time held out that hope that he'd come back home.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I was always very impressed. So what year did you start noticing symptoms in Bob?
In 2009, right about 2009. And he was officially diagnosed in 2011 at University Hospital in Denver.
Okay. So I came here in 2012. And he had, by the time I came, I grew up here, but by the time when I came back in 2012 and I saw Bob, his symptoms were already fairly obvious. And so, it seems to me like it progressed fairly quickly. I don't know if it felt that way to you. But you kind of allude there that he was fighting it and you guys were fighting it really hard. But you just weren't able to very much. This is a disease that just grabs you, and there's not as much fighting as you can do. Right. Tell me about that. Was that tough? I mean, you were a PT.
That was really tough, extremely difficult, because with physical therapy, you get a diagnosis, you go to rehab, and you pretty much recover, or at least you don't get worse. Yeah. And that was my whole goal, was we can find something that will slow this progression down. And once we have behavior managed, he'll be fine. Yeah. And, I'm kind of stubborn, and I thought, I'm not going to give up on this. All we need is the right doctor, the right medication, and we'll be fine.
Yeah. So when you weren't finding the right doctor and the right medication, were you frustrated, then getting frustrated with those that you had and get rid of them and get someone else in there? Or how did you react to that?
Yes, exactly. Yes, I was frustrated. We even went to the University of Pennsylvania. They have a very strong department in frontal temporal dementia. So we went there, and he got tested and confirmed the diagnosis. But every place we turned, they said, well, we can try this medication for anxiety and anger and all of that. And then, we tried for a while, and then the symptoms came back or whatever. We just couldn't find anything. And, it took me a long time to accept the fact that there is no cure for this. And I had to come to grips with, I couldn't blame the doctor because he wasn't getting any better.
Right. You made a career for yourself, you and Bob both, careers out of making people better. And this
Right.
was something that just wasn't gonna
Right.
happen in the same way.
Right.
I know that Bob lived in a number of different facilities. That seemed like it was a struggle for you as well, finding the right place for Bob.
Right.
And some of them were good. I mean, but it's maybe not right for him. Is that right? How did?
Absolutely.
I'm sure a lot of people have or will deal with this exact thing. So that's why I'm asking you about that. I think you're helpful.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually every one of the facilities was fine. They just didn't meet Bob's needs.
Yeah.
Do you want me to specifically refer to a name?
You don't have to, unless there's something you want to share. Yeah, we're not out to put a grade F on some certain facility or something.
Okay. Okay.
Tell me what you loved about the last one he was in.
Okay, the last, well, let me tell you, the other, he was at 3, okay?
Yeah.
And I have to say, at some point, it made me feel a little better to know that not only could I handle Bob's behaviors, but neither could they, you know? And so, and part of the reason was the way the facility was set up. Bob was a pacer, and he was never in his room. He was always out looking for people to help. Telling the nurses they were doing a good job, all kinds of things. He wasn't somebody who stayed in his room. No. And many times he would interfere with some other people doing what they were supposed to be doing. And, the staff got frustrated with that. Yeah. So after being in one facility, they said, we can't meet his needs. And then there was another one who said, we specialize in people who are active and are pacers. Yeah. So they gave it a try, and the facility itself didn't lend to him being out and about as much as he wanted to be. So finally, the third one, and I'll mention that name if that's okay. Yeah, the third one was at Brookdale, and that was right off of Academy in Maysland.
Yeah, by Palmer Park there.
Correct, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what really worked for him was they allowed him, first of all, to pace. Mm-hmm. And there were different neighborhoods in that facility. Yeah. He was in one neighborhood, and he'd walk to the next neighborhood, and they'd say, oh, hi, Bob. And then he'd go to the next neighborhood. And there were many times when I would come in to see him, and I didn't know where he was. And they would say, can we they get on their walkie-talkie. He said, can we have a location on Bob? Oh, he's over here in Boathouse. We'll feed him over here today. And so you see, they allowed him to be Bob as long as he could be.
At the second place he was at, I don't know if you know the story. I went to visit him once, and it was this beautiful day, and he was inside walking, and that place was just too small for Bob. I felt like he was walking in this circle always. Right. So I said, Bob, how about we go outside? They had a big fenced area outside. And he said, yeah. And I told the staff, and they said, are you sure? I said, sure, absolutely, no problem. And he walked outside, and he walked right up to the top of this hill. Oh, yeah. There's a fence, and the sprinklers are just going off. So it's sopping wet, and I'm trying to lure Bob back down into the facility, and he's all wet, and I'm all wet, and the staff's just laughing at us. So having that final place where he could walk, he probably got more exercise there than he ever did in his life. He walked all day.
Right.
And that was what he needed. That was perfect.
He did. Yeah, and the outside was just perfect for that too, and because it was enclosed, but yet he could walk as much as he wanted.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
So I think finding the right facility is really a tough thing, and a lot of people have trouble with that because not every place will meet their needs, for sure.
And there's no magic facility. It's not like one that's right for everybody, right? Like this was the right one for Bob. Though the staff there was really good about accommodating. I noticed that too.
Yes, they were. I mean, no place is perfect. There were issues that, you have to deal with. But, but they allowed him to be himself as long as he could.
One of the things I've heard from spouses of someone who's died from dementia is that they start to feel like they're grieving early, because you lose so much of the person's, in some cases, personality. I don't know if that happens so much with Bob, but ability to communicate with them, live with them. And so you start to almost grieve before the death. But of course, then there's a whole nother round of grieving when someone dies. Was that true for you, or was it a different experience for you?
I don't think I allowed myself to grieve early on.
Yeah.
Because it was such a purpose for me to find a solution, or to at least, look for ways that we could manage this. And I guess I just never said to myself, this is, I don't know. I don't think I allowed myself to grieve. I mean, yes, there were times I missed certain things about Bob, for sure.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was hard, and maybe this will help other people whose husbands are going through this kind of thing, is that sometimes he would be right on. Like, sometimes he would be so off. And the next thing for example, I would take him out for a drive, and he'd all of a sudden say, okay, now watch out here, slow down.
Yeah.
And so it was almost like a tease. I would get, and then I think, okay, well, he must be getting better. So I think I didn't allow myself to totally grieve then, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah.
I know that since Bob's death, there's been a small informal group of folks that have met to support one another here at Ascension.
Yes.
Can you tell me a bit about, we don't have to say who everyone is, but can you tell me a bit about that group and how that's been helpful for you?
I think that's a great thing. I'm so glad that we're doing that, because you got to have some support. The caregiver's job is very tough. It's very tough, because you're the bad guy. A lot of times you make the decisions on behalf of your husband. And so, you're the one that has to deal with how they react to that.
Sure.
And so I think it's wonderful that we are meeting. We try to meet twice a month, and it gives everyone a chance to say what they're dealing with right now. And, I hope that through my experience that I could maybe share some resources, share some books that were helpful to me. And I just think it's a great thing to do, for sure.
I think, when I hear you tell your story, and from me back when, before Bob died, one of the things I was always impressed with, and I hope others take from this, I feel like I hear a lot of people say they want to keep their loved one at home as long as possible, and then they feel like they're giving up on them if they have them live somewhere else. But you were an example to me of someone who wasn't giving up at all, right? It was finding the best place for Bob. And then, like, you were as active as anybody in caring for Bob, even though he wasn't living at home, like a thorn in the side of the staff. You were doing whatever it took, right? And I think that's just like a good model, that if living at home is not appropriate for someone, that doesn't mean that you're not still actively involved in their care and that you don't still love them. So there's no question there. I just applaud you for that.
Right. Do you know what I found? Because of that time frame before he was admitted, I really was kind of the bad guy. I mean, he was not happy with me.
Sure.
And so once I wasn't the actual everyday caregiver, we would have much better time together when in the facility. I felt like I was more the wife than the dictator. And it was really something. I felt like I went there every day that I could possibly go. And it seemed like when I got there, he seemed to know when I was there, we were going to do something. Because I would walk in and he'd say, "Come on, Sal." And I'd say, "Okay." And so we spent some quality time together. And that was something that I didn't expect, because I felt terrible about putting him in a facility. But at the same time, as the time went on, I felt that we still had a relationship, and it was somewhat better than it was when I was at home with him.
That's a lot to that. I think you're right. You by putting someone in a facility, you're hiring out the work that is hard for you to do. But the thing you can't hire out is that care, those sharing those quality moments together. And so it was allowing you to do the part that only you could do. You were allowed to do that better.
Right.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right,
think one other thing about the caregiver, I just think everybody has a different situation,
Sure.
Maybe if Bob sat on a recliner all day, that might have been a different, decision for me. But I think I was almost forced to make that decision basically because of the behavior component of this disease.
Yeah.
So anyway, and everybody's got to make their own decision.
Absolutely. Sure. You happen to have a husband who, climbed Pikes Peak 24 times as part of the incline, that, or the ascent. That's who you had. And so
Right.
that was his nature, to be that wanderer,
Right.
in
Right.
that sense.
Yeah.
What sources of comfort and peace have you found as you've dealt with Bob's death after the fact? We talked about that support group, but anything else that's been meaningful for you?
Well, I have to say that I was very fortunate that one of the people that I worked with in the Harrison School District, her husband was diagnosed with primary progressive aphasia around the same time. Well, a little even earlier. She was a tremendous support to me, for sure, because she was going through sort of the same things. We were also, and this might help other people, the Alzheimer's Association had a really good support group, and it was a couples support group, so that the person with the disease would get together with the other spouse that was in that same condition, and we, the caregivers, would meet. That was very good. I got some very good advice, not advice, but support from you, Pastor Daniel. I have, and from Pastor Dan, and from other members of our church. One thing I never was very good about was asking for help. And I remember talking to Judy Heron, and she said, Salinda, you just need to tell us what you need. And once I said, I could use some people coming to visit him on days that I wasn't able to come, or times that I went to see my family. And that was wonderful. They were very, very supportive. And I'm sure they got the entire tour of Brookdale every time they went to visit him. But,
we've all been in all the neighborhoods of Brookdale.
But that was wonderful support, for sure. Yeah. And in
That's
terms of, I'll tell you this, in terms of my faith, something like this really, I think, tests your faith. It tested my faith, for sure. So having all that support helped me, but there were times when I questioned God. Why did this happen to Bob? He could have used you. I felt like I said, you could have used Bob for so many things, and yet you needed him to come home early. So that was tough. It was really tough.
I don't doubt it. Well, Salinda, I want to thank you for doing this conversation with me. We're doing it via Zoom, which is not ideal, and it's a topic that matters greatly to you, but still is a challenging one. So I know that's not easy. So thank you very much. We'll have an opportunity to discuss this with others as well on Sunday, and so hopefully folks join us for that. And thanks so much. And I'm going to stop our recording here, and we'll connect with everybody else in the interview.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm hoping that I can help someone with it. But thanks for asking me.
Absolutely.
Okay.